The lost moment. You can't remember the last moment you were awake last night. Not because you weren't paying attention, but because your brain made sure you couldn't. There's a blind spot in your memory that opens every evening, and tonight it will open again. Welcome. If you find yourself here often, searching for something to quiet the night, you might want to stay. We're going to explore something you experience every day but have never actually witnessed. The moment consciousness disappears. This isn't about sleep itself. It's about the edge, the transition, that vanishing point where you stop being awake and become something else entirely. You've crossed this threshold thousands of times, and you've never caught it happening. Not once. The strange thing is, you probably assume you just don't remember because you were tired, distracted, already half asleep. But that's not quite right. The truth is more unsettling. Your brain is physiologically incapable of recording the moment you fall asleep. The very systems that would need to capture that memory shut down to allow sleep to begin. It's a gap built into the architecture of consciousness itself, a blind spot not in your vision but in your ability to know your own mind. And once you notice it's there, you start to wonder what else you're missing. Think about the last time you tried to catch yourself falling asleep. Maybe you were lying in bed, aware of your breathing, feeling your thoughts start to drift. You told yourself to stay alert, to notice the exact moment, and then it was morning. What happened in between isn't really a mystery. You fell asleep. But there's something more peculiar at work. The reason you can't remember that transition isn't about attention or effort. It's because the part of your brain responsible for forming new memories, a small curved structure called the hippocampus, essentially stops recording during the shift from wake to sleep. The hippocampus sits deep in your brain, tucked beneath the cerebral cortex, and it acts like a biological recording device. Throughout your waking hours, it takes the flood of sensations, thoughts, and experiences and begins converting them into memories. But this process requires energy, coordination, and most importantly, it requires you to be awake. Memory formation is an active process. Sleep is not. Here's the conflict. To fall asleep, your brain needs to stop doing many of the things it does while awake. It needs to reduce sensory processing, quiet internal chatter, and yes, stop encoding new memories. The hippocampus can't simultaneously record your experience and allow your brain to transition into sleep. So it makes a choice. It lets the recording lapse. Neuroscientists have tracked this using brain imaging. They can watch the hippocampus light up with activity during waking hours, then see that activity dim as someone drifts towards sleep. The dimming happens gradually at first, then more rapidly as sleep deepens. But there's a crucial window, a span of maybe 30 seconds to a few minutes, where the hippocampus has already stopped encoding reliably, but consciousness hasn't fully vanished yet. You're still aware in some fuzzy sense, but the machine that would save that awareness for later has already shut off. This means the last few minutes before sleep exist in a kind of neurological no man's land. You experience them in a way, but they never get transferred into the kind of stable memory you could recall later. They're lived, then immediately lost. It's not that the memory fades over time. It never forms in the first place. The gap is structural, biological, unavoidable. Your brain has built you to forget this particular threshold, and no amount of focus can overcome that design. You probably feel like your awareness flows smoothly from one moment to the next, an unbroken stream of experience. But that continuity is something your brain constructs after the fact, stitching together fragments into what feels like seamless time. Consciousness doesn't actually work like a flowing river. It's more like a series of still photographs projected so quickly they appear to move. Your brain samples reality in discrete moments, snapshots of sensation, thought, and perception, and then creates the impression of continuity by blending these snapshots together. Most of the time, this illusion holds perfectly. You move through your day feeling present, unbroken, whole. Sleep onset exposes the seams, because when your brain stops stitching those moments together, when the projector slows and finally stops, you don't notice the gap. You can't. The part of you that would notice is the very thing disappearing. During waking hours, there's a constant neural process running in the background that links each moment to the next, creating your sense of now extending smoothly into the next, now. This process involves multiple brain regions coordinating their activity, passing information back and forth, maintaining the feeling that you are continuously present. But this coordination is fragile. It requires energy, attention, and wakefulness. As you approach sleep, this coordination begins to break down. The snapshots come slower, the gaps between them widen, but your conscious mind doesn't experience this as fragmentation, at least not usually. Instead, you just feel drowsy, heavy, like your thoughts are getting sluggish. You don't feel yourself coming apart. The illusion holds almost until the very end. Then there's a moment, impossible to identify, where the stitching stops entirely, the snapshots cease, the projector goes dark, and because there's no consciousness present to observe this cessation, no memory system still recording, the transition feels instantaneous when you try to think back on it. One moment you are lying in bed, the next you're waking up. 8 hours compressed into what feels like a single blink. This reveals something profound about the nature of awareness itself. Consciousness isn't a fundamental property of your brain, always present in the background. It's an active process, something your brain does rather than something it has. And like any process, it can be interrupted, paused, stopped. The fact that you don't experience the stopping doesn't mean it isn't happening. It just means the experience of continuity is itself part of the illusion. Your brain builds the feeling of unbroken time, and when it stops building, there's nothing left to notice the absence. Buried deep in the center of your brain, there's a structure about the size of a walnut that controls more of your conscious experience than you might imagine. It's called the thalamus, and it functions as a gatekeeper for almost everything you perceive. Every sensation from the outside world, the pressure of the pillow against your cheek, the sound of distant traffic, the dim light filtering through your eyelids, travels first through the thalamus before reaching the parts of your brain that process it consciously. The thalamus decides what gets through and what gets filtered out. During waking hours, this gate stays mostly open. You're receiving a constant stream of sensory information, even if you're not actively paying attention to all of it. But as you move towards sleep, the thalamus begins to close. Slowly, selectively, it starts blocking signals. First, it might reduce the intensity of external sounds, making that traffic noise fade into the background. Then it might dampen the feeling of the sheets against your skin. The room doesn't get darker, but your perception of its darkness diminishes. Your brain is still receiving these signals, but they're being stopped at the gate, prevented from reaching consciousness. This happens gradually, which is part of why you don't notice it. There's no single moment where the world suddenly goes quiet. Instead, there's a gentle dimming, a softening of reality that feels natural, even comfortable. You might notice that sounds seem farther away, or that your body feels heavier, more distant. But these changes feel like drowsiness, not like a gate closing. You interpret them as you getting tired, not as the world being actively filtered out by a small cluster of neurons in the center of your head. The remarkable thing about the thalamus is how coordinated this shutdown is. It's not just blocking random signals, it's carefully orchestrating the transition, allowing some information through while stopping others, maintaining just enough awareness to keep you oriented until sleep takes over completely. If the thalamus shut down too quickly, you'd lose consciousness abruptly, which could be dangerous. If it stayed open too long, you'd never fall asleep at all. So it performs this delicate dance, closing gradually, selectively, in a sequence that feels natural to your conscious mind, even as that mind is dissolving. The thalamus is, in a sense, managing your disappearance. And because it's happening below the level of conscious control, below the level of memory formation, you're entirely unaware that this gate is closing until it's already closed. The architecture of the transition hides itself from the thing transitioning. You can't watch your own awareness being filtered away because the filter is part of what creates awareness in the first place. The boundary between wake and sleep isn't as clear as you might think. Even during what you'd consider full wakefulness, your brain occasionally slips into brief moments of unconsciousness. These are called microsleeps, and they last anywhere from a fraction of a second to several seconds. During a microsleep, your brain enters a state indistinguishable from light sleep, but you typically don't notice it happening. Microsleeps occur most often when you're sleep deprived or engaged in monotonous tasks. Someone driving on a long, empty highway might experience dozens of them, their brain flickering on and off like a faulty light bulb. From the inside, it might feel like a brief lapse in attention, a momentary blank, or nothing at all. But brainwave recordings show something more dramatic: consciousness actually disappearing, then returning, then disappearing again. This suggests that the division between wake and sleep is not a single line you cross, but a blurred zone you drift through. Your brain doesn't flip a switch from awake to asleep. Instead, it wavers, oscillates, tests the waters. Microsleeps are your brain practicing the transition, dipping briefly into unconsciousness even while external circumstances require wakefulness. What makes this unsettling is what it reveals about consciousness itself. If your awareness can blink out for a second or two in the middle of the day without you noticing, then continuity of consciousness is even more fragile than the sleep onset problem suggests. You might think you've been awake all day, but in reality, there could be dozens of tiny gaps, moments where you simply weren't present. Your brain papers over these gaps automatically, creates the sense that time flowed smoothly, that you were there the whole time. These microsleeps also blur the edge of intentional sleep. When you're lying in bed trying to fall asleep, you might be experiencing these same brief dropouts. You're awake, then not, then awake again, then not again. Each time you slip into microsleep, your brain gets a little closer to committing to full sleep. The transition isn't a single vanishing point, but a series of attempts, a gradual dissolution where consciousness flickers and fades like a candle in the wind. This is part of why catching the moment of sleep onset is impossible. There isn't one moment, there's a cascade of moments, a gradual failing of the systems that keep you aware. Each microsleep is a small rehearsal for the final fade, and because each one is too brief for memory formation, because each gap is immediately covered over by the illusion of continuity, you experience the whole process as a smooth descent, rather than the stuttering, fragmentary dissolution it actually is. There's a network of brain regions that activates most strongly when you're not doing anything in particular. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, and it's most active during rest, daydreaming, and introspection. This network is often described as the neurological basis of the self, the you that exists when you're just existing, thinking about your life, planning the future, remembering the past. The default mode network includes several regions, but notably the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. When these areas communicate with each other, they create the experience of self-reference, of being someone with a continuous identity, a life story, a perspective on the world. This is the network that maintains your sense of I. As you move towards sleep, the default mode network begins to quiet. This happens gradually, not all at once, and it's distinct from the sensory filtering performed by the thalamus. While the thalamus controls what information enters consciousness, the default mode network controls the sense that there's someone present to receive that information. Its deactivation is the dissolution of the self-referential perspective itself. In the early stages of drowsiness, you might notice your thoughts becoming less personal. Instead of thinking, I need to remember to call tomorrow, you might have a vague floating thought about calling, without the strong sense of I attached to it. Your internal narrative starts to loosen. Memories drift by without the usual autobiographical context. You're still thinking, but the thoughts feel less like yours. This is the default mode network beginning its retreat. The connections between its component regions weaken, the conversation they hold with each other, the one that creates the feeling of being a continuous self, starts to fade, and as it fades, so does the coherence of your internal experience. Thoughts become more fragmented. The boundary between self and non-self blurs. You're still aware in some sense, but the awareness is no longer clearly organized around a central you. By the time you're truly asleep, the default mode network has gone almost completely silent. In dreams, it sometimes reactivates, which is why dreams can have a sense of self, a protagonist experiencing events. But during deep sleep, it's quiet. The self as a neural process has dissolved. This dissolution is part of why you can't capture the moment of sleep onset. The thing doing the capturing, your sense of self, your perspective, your I, is precisely what's disappearing. It's not just that memory fails. It's that the entity who would form the memory is in the process of ceasing to exist, at least temporarily. When the default mode network shuts down, there's no longer a coherent center of experience to say, this is happening to me, and without that center, there's nothing to encode the experience of its own disappearance. It's worth asking why we're built this way. Why did evolution design our brains so we can't remember falling asleep? What advantage could there be in this blind spot? One possibility is that remembering sleep onset would actually make sleeping harder. Imagine if you could vividly recall the sensation of consciousness dissolving every single night, the vulnerability of it, the loss of control, the feeling of your sense of self coming apart. For many people, this would create anxiety rather than peace. The process needs to feel natural, inevitable, safe. Memory might interfere with that. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive closure, the desire for definite answers, for completion, for knowing how things end. People generally don't like uncertainty, especially about experiences they're actively having. If your brain maintained full awareness and memory formation right up until the moment of sleep, you'd be stuck in an impossible situation, trying to observe the end of observation itself, trying to know the moment knowing stops. This could create a kind of mental loop, a self-defeating vigilance that prevents the very state it's trying to witness. Evolution doesn't optimize for curiosity. It optimizes for survival and reproduction. An organism that can fall asleep quickly and reliably has an advantage over one that lies awake contemplating the phenomenology of consciousness dissolution. Sleep is too important, too essential for memory consolidation, immune function, metabolic regulation, to be disrupted by metacognitive awareness. There's also the matter of vulnerability. Sleep requires letting go of vigilance, at least to some degree. Our ancestors who could surrender to sleep without existential hesitation probably slept better than those who remained anxiously aware of their own fading consciousness. Better sleep meant better recovery, sharper thinking the next day, improved survival odds. The anxiety-prone insomniacs, the ones who couldn't stop watching their own minds, might have slept poorly enough to suffer real consequences. So perhaps this blind spot is a gift, not a limitation. Perhaps the inability to capture sleep onset is precisely what allows it to happen smoothly. The gap in memory creates a gap in self-consciousness, and that gap creates permission to let go. Your brain hides the transition from you because showing it to you would make the transition harder to complete. This doesn't mean the question stops being interesting. We can still wonder about the moment we can't capture, still explore the edges of this blind spot, still find it remarkable that something so routine remains so mysterious. But maybe we can also appreciate that the mystery serves a purpose. The forgetting isn't a bug, it's a feature that allows consciousness to rest by ensuring consciousness doesn't watch itself fade. If you could watch your own brain activity as you fell asleep, you'd see waves. Not literal waves, but patterns of electrical activity that sweep across the brain in rhythmic cycles. And these patterns change dramatically as consciousness fades. During alert wakefulness, your brain produces what are called beta waves, relatively fast oscillations, around 13 to 30 cycles per second. These fast waves reflect the busy, active state of a brain that's processing information, making decisions, staying vigilant. Beta waves dominate when you're focused, engaged, problem-solving. They're the electrical signature of attention. As you start to relax, beta waves give way to alpha waves, slower oscillations, around 8 to 13 cycles per second. Alpha waves emerge when you close your eyes, when you stop actively focusing on external tasks, when you let your mind wander. They're associated with relaxed wakefulness, the calm you feel when you're awake but not effortfully doing anything. Lying in bed with the lights off, your brain probably begins producing more alpha waves as you prepare for sleep. Then comes the shift to theta waves, slower still, around 4 to 8 cycles per second. Theta waves mark the transition zone between wakefulness and sleep. They appear during drowsiness, during meditation, during that hypnagogic state where you're not quite awake but not quite asleep either. If you've ever caught yourself drifting and then jolted back to alertness, you probably moved briefly into theta wave activity before your brain pulled you back to alpha or beta. These shifts happen gradually, not like switching channels, but like a radio signal fading from one frequency to another. The brain doesn't suddenly stop producing fast waves and start producing slow ones. Instead, there's a period where both coexist, where fast waves become less frequent and slow waves become more prominent. The overall pattern slows down, softens, like music transitioning from an upbeat tempo to something more languid. What's remarkable is how precisely these wave patterns correlate with subjective experience. When researchers monitor brain waves and occasionally wake people to ask what they were experiencing, the reports align with the electrical patterns. Fast beta waves correspond to clear, focused thought. Alpha waves correspond to relaxed, drifting awareness. Theta waves correspond to that strange in-between state where thoughts become unpredictable and logic starts to dissolve. Eventually, if sleep continues, delta waves emerge, very slow oscillations, less than 4 cycles per second. Delta waves dominate deep sleep, the stage where consciousness seems most fully absent, where waking someone is difficult and disorienting. But you don't experience the arrival of delta waves. By the time they appear, you're already gone. The descent through beta, alpha, and theta, that's the journey you take toward disappearance. Delta is what happens after. These aren't just abstract measurements. They represent the fundamental rhythm of neural activity, the way billions of neurons coordinate their firing. Fast waves mean neurons are firing in brief, irregular bursts. Slow waves mean neurons are firing in long, synchronized pulses. The slowing of brain waves is, in a physical sense, the slowing of thought itself, the gradual coordination of neural activity into longer, deeper cycles that characterize unconsciousness. There's a strange territory between wakefulness and sleep, where the rules of normal consciousness break down. It's called the hypnagogic state. And if you've ever caught yourself in it, you know how peculiar it can be. In hypnagogia, you might see images that aren't there, flashes of faces, landscapes, patterns. These aren't dreams exactly, because you're not fully asleep. They're more like visual noise, fragments of imagery that appear spontaneously as your brain's visual processing systems start to fire without external input. Sometimes these images are vivid and detailed, other times they're abstract, geometric, flickering. You might also hear things, voices saying words that don't quite make sense, music playing somewhere far away, your own name being called. These auditory hallucinations can be startling, especially if you're not expecting them, but they're entirely normal. They're your auditory cortex activating spontaneously, creating sound perceptions without any actual sound reaching your ears. Then there are the thoughts themselves. In hypnagogia, thinking becomes strange. Ideas drift by that seem profound in the moment but dissolve into nonsense if you try to hold on to them. You might have insights that feel revolutionary, only to realize, if you rouse yourself enough to examine them, that they're completely illogical. The part of your brain that evaluates coherence, that checks whether thoughts make sense, is starting to shut down, but the part that generates thoughts is still active, so you get thought production without thought regulation. Some people experience physical sensations, a feeling of falling, which sometimes triggers a sudden jerk that pulls you back to wakefulness. A sense of floating or spinning, the perception that your body is enormous or tiny, that your limbs are in impossible positions. These are called proprioceptive hallucinations, distortions in your brain's sense of where your body is in space. The hypnagogic state typically lasts only a few minutes, but those minutes can feel much longer or shorter. Time perception becomes unreliable. You might think you've been lying there for an hour when it's been 2 minutes, or you might feel like only seconds have passed when it's been much longer. What makes hypnagogia fascinating from a neuroscience perspective is that it reveals the brain's normal operations coming apart in sequence. During full wakefulness, your sensory systems, thought processes, and reality testing mechanisms all work together to create a coherent experience of the world. In hypnagogia, these systems start to desynchronize. Sensory systems begin generating internal noise, thought processes lose their logical constraints, reality testing fails to catch the errors. The result is this borderland experience, this liminal consciousness where almost anything can seem to happen. Most people pass through hypnagogia without noticing it consciously, or they only catch brief glimpses before slipping fully into sleep. But it's always there, this strange interlude, this evidence that consciousness doesn't have a simple on-off switch. Instead, it has a transition zone, a twilight where the usual rules suspend and the mind becomes something other than its waking self. If you were to watch an electroencephalogram recording of someone falling asleep, you'd eventually start seeing distinctive patterns appear among the slow waves. Two patterns in particular stand out: sleep spindles and K complexes. These electrical signatures mark the brain's commitment to sleep, the point where the transition becomes difficult to reverse. Sleep spindles are brief bursts of brain activity, lasting 1 to 2 seconds, where neurons fire in a rapid, synchronized rhythm at around 12 to 16 cycles per second. They appear suddenly against the slower background of theta waves, like a brief acceleration in an otherwise decelerating pattern. On an EEG, they look like their name suggests, spindle-shaped bursts of activity that rise, sustain briefly, and then fade. These spindles are generated by interactions between the thalamus and the cortex. Remember the thalamus, the sensory gatekeeper? During sleep, it doesn't just passively block incoming signals. It actively generates these rhythmic bursts and sends them to the cortex. The cortex responds, and the back and forth creates the spindle pattern. Neuroscientists believe sleep spindles play a role in memory consolidation, helping to transfer information from short-term to long-term storage. They appear most frequently during the lighter stages of sleep, before you descend into deeper unconsciousness. K complexes are different, sharp, dramatic spikes in brain activity that last about a second. They're the largest and most distinctive waves that occur during sleep. If you graphed them, they'd look like sudden, steep mountains rising from a relatively flat landscape. K complexes can occur spontaneously, but they can also be triggered by external stimuli like sounds. They're thought to represent the brain's way of checking whether something in the environment requires attention without fully waking up. Here's what's interesting. Once sleep spindles and K complexes start appearing regularly, you're in what's called stage 2 sleep. At this point, you're no longer in that ambiguous hypnagogic zone. You're definitively asleep, even if it's still relatively light sleep. If someone tried to wake you now, they'd have to put in some effort. Your name called softly wouldn't do it. These electrical signatures represent the brain digging in, committing to the sleep state. The appearance of sleep spindles and K complexes also correlates with the subjective disappearance of awareness. When researchers wake people shortly after these patterns emerge, most people report no conscious experience just before waking. They weren't thinking, weren't dreaming, weren't aware of anything. They were simply gone. The presence of these patterns seems to coincide with the extinguishing of whatever minimal consciousness might have lingered in the hypnagogic state. So in a sense, sleep spindles and K complexes are the brain's signature on a contract. They're the neurological equivalent of saying, "We're doing this, we're committing." Before they appear, you're still negotiating with sleep, still hovering at the edge. Once they show up consistently, the negotiation is over. The transition has completed, and the brain is now fully engaged in the processes of sleep rather than wakefulness. These patterns are the timestamp of your disappearance, the marker you can never witness from the inside. Your brain contains multiple systems working in opposition, some promoting wakefulness, others promoting sleep. Throughout the day, the wakefulness systems dominate, but as evening arrives, the balance shifts. The arousal system relies on several neurotransmitters to keep you alert. Norepinephrine, produced in a small region called the locus coeruleus, acts like a broadcast signal for vigilance. When norepinephrine levels are high, you're ready to respond to threats, opportunities, anything requiring attention. It's the chemical of alertness, the substance that keeps your mind sharp and reactive. Histamine, released from neurons in the hypothalamus, serves a similar purpose. It promotes wakefulness and helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. When you take an antihistamine medication for allergies, one of the side effects is often drowsiness. That's because you're blocking histamine's wake-promoting effects. Orexin is another key player. Also produced in the hypothalamus, orexin neurons project throughout the brain, stabilizing wakefulness and preventing unwanted transitions into sleep. People with narcolepsy who experience sudden, uncontrollable sleep attacks often have damage to their orexin-producing neurons. Without orexin's stabilizing influence, the boundary between wake and sleep becomes dangerously porous. As you prepare for sleep, these arousal systems need to quiet. Norepinephrine release decreases, histamine activity declines, orexin neurons reduce their firing. This doesn't happen because you will it to happen. It happens because other systems in your brain start exerting opposing pressure. GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, begins to dominate. GABA works by reducing neural activity, by making it harder for neurons to fire. When GABA levels rise, the brain's overall activity level drops. Thoughts slow down, sensory processing diminishes. The arousal systems, bathed in increasing GABA, find it harder to maintain their usual activity levels. Adenosine also accumulates. Unlike the other substances mentioned, adenosine isn't exactly a neurotransmitter. It's more like a metabolic signal. The longer you're awake, the more adenosine builds up in your brain. It accumulates as a byproduct of energy use, and its presence creates what's called sleep pressure. High adenosine levels make you feel tired, drowsy, ready to sleep. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors, temporarily preventing you from feeling this sleep pressure. But the adenosine doesn't go away, it just waits for the caffeine to wear off. The shift from wakefulness to sleep is, at the neurochemical level, a changing of the guard. The arousal chemicals that dominated your day recede. The sleep-promoting chemicals that have been building in the background come forward, and this changing of the guard happens below the level of conscious control. You can't will your norepinephrine system to stay active any more than you can will your adenosine levels to drop. The chemical tide moves according to its own schedule, influenced by circadian rhythms, by how long you've been awake, by environmental cues like darkness and quiet. This is part of why you can't catch the moment of falling asleep. It's not just that memory fails or that consciousness fragments. It's that the very chemical systems underlying consciousness are being actively shut down, replaced by systems that promote unconsciousness. The infrastructure of awareness is being dismantled at the molecular level. And the dismantling happens whether you notice it or not. Deep in your brainstem, in a region called the pons, something remarkable begins happening even before you fall fully asleep. Neural activity starts preparing for REM sleep, the stage associated with vivid dreams, even while you're still in the early stages of sleep onset. This activity takes the form of distinctive electrical signals called pontine geniculate occipital waves, or PGO waves. The name describes their path. They originate in the pons, travel through the geniculate nucleus in the thalamus, and end up in the occipital cortex, which processes vision. These waves are sharp, intense bursts of activity that appear to prime the visual system for the hallucinations we call dreams. PGO waves are most prominent during REM sleep, but they also appear during the transition into sleep. They're like scouts sent ahead, preparing the terrain for what's to come. While your conscious mind is still flickering in the hypnagogic state, while the higher regions of your brain are winding down, these ancient brainstem structures are already initiating the machinery of dreams. The pons is one of the oldest parts of the human brain in evolutionary terms. It handles basic functions, breathing, sleeping, arousal. It doesn't create the rich narrative experiences we associate with consciousness, but it does generate the raw material that higher brain regions use to construct dreams. PGO waves represent the brainstem's contribution to the dream process, bursts of activation that the visual cortex interprets and elaborates into imagery. What's fascinating is the timing. PGO waves can appear before you've lost awareness completely. This suggests that dream generation begins before consciousness ends. The hypnagogic hallucinations people sometimes experience, those flashes of faces or landscapes, might be early manifestations of PGO wave activity. the brainstem testing its dream-generating systems while you're still partially awake to notice. This creates a strange temporal overlap. While the prefrontal cortex is shutting down, while the hippocampus stops encoding memories, while the thalamus closes its sensory gates, the pons is ramping up. Parts of your brain are ending their day while other parts are beginning a different kind of work. You are, in a sense, multiple processes running in parallel, and these processes don't all transition at the same rate. The fact that PGO waves originate in such an ancient brain structure also suggests something about the evolutionary history of sleep. Dreaming, or at least the neural activity underlying it, might be older than the kind of consciousness we experience during waking hours. The brainstem was generating these patterns long before the prefrontal cortex evolved to create self-awareness and rational thought. Sleep and dreams might be the default state, the ancient pattern, with wakefulness being the more recent evolutionary addition. If that's true, then falling asleep isn't really about consciousness ending. It's about consciousness returning to an older mode, a mode that predates language and logic and self-reflection. The brainstem keeps working through it all, keeps generating its rhythms and patterns, indifferent to whether the higher brain regions are online or not. PGO waves are a reminder that sleep isn't absence but transformation, a shift from one kind of brain activity to another, older kind. Sometimes, just when you're on the edge of sleep, your brain does something unexpected. It surges back into alertness. Your heart rate increases slightly, your thoughts sharpen, you feel suddenly, frustratingly awake. This phenomenon is called paradoxical wakefulness, and it's more common than you might think. Paradoxical wakefulness appears to be a final check, a last-moment arousal before the brain commits to sleep. Some researchers think it's an evolutionary remnant, a final scan for threats before entering the vulnerable state of unconsciousness. In our distant past, falling asleep in a dangerous environment could be fatal. Perhaps the brain evolved this last-minute vigilance spike as a way to ensure the environment was truly safe. This surge can be triggered by internal or external factors. Sometimes it's a small noise, not quite loud enough to be consciously registered, but enough to activate the arousal system briefly. Sometimes it's a thought, a sudden remembering of something forgotten, a worry that surfaces just as you are starting to drift. Sometimes it seems to happen for no reason at all, just a spontaneous fluctuation in the neurochemical systems managing the sleep transition. What makes it paradoxical is the timing. Logic suggests that as you get closer to sleep, you should become progressively less alert. The trajectory should be smooth, a steady decline into unconsciousness. But instead, there's sometimes this counterintuitive spike, this brief reversal, right at the threshold. It's as if the brain, sensing how close it is to the edge, pulls back for one more look around. For people with insomnia, paradoxical wakefulness can become a significant problem. Each time they approach sleep, this arousal surge yanks them back. The frustration of being pulled away from sleep just as it seems within reach can create anxiety about sleep itself, which then makes the arousal surges more likely and more intense. A feedback loop develops. Anticipating the surge makes the surge more likely, which reinforces the anticipation. But even for people without insomnia, paradoxical wakefulness occasionally appears. You're drifting, settling, almost there, and then suddenly you're aware again, more alert than you were a moment ago. The sensation can be disorienting. You might wonder what woke you, but often there's no clear answer. The waking came from inside, from the brain's own regulatory systems, not from any external disturbance. This reveals something about the transition to sleep. It's not passive, it's not just a matter of energy running down, consciousness fading like a battery dying. The brain is actively managing the transition, monitoring it, sometimes hesitating. Sleep requires a kind of surrender, a letting go of vigilance, and the brain doesn't always surrender smoothly. Sometimes it pulls back, reconsiders, checks one more time. The moment of sleep onset isn't just lost to memory, it's sometimes delayed by the brain's own protective hesitation, its unwillingness to let go until conditions are just right. For some people, the problem isn't that they can't remember falling asleep, it's that they can't let themselves fall asleep in the first place. The transition itself, the loss of control, the dissolution of awareness, creates anxiety that keeps them awake. This is different from ordinary sleeplessness. It's not about racing thoughts or physical discomfort. It's about fear of the threshold itself, fear of that moment when consciousness lets go. And because they fear it, they hold on. They maintain vigilance, keep checking whether they're still awake. And in doing so, they prevent the very transition they're desperate to achieve. The paradox is cruel. Sleep requires not trying to sleep, not monitoring whether it's happening, not staying alert to catch the moment, but someone afraid of losing control can't stop monitoring. They lie there, aware of their breathing, of their thoughts, waiting to feel sleep arrive. And that waiting, that watching, that vigilance, it's the opposite of what's needed. This anxiety often has roots in trust. To fall asleep, you have to trust that letting go of consciousness is safe, that you'll return, that nothing terrible will happen in that vulnerable, unconscious state. For someone who has trouble trusting, maybe because of past trauma, maybe because of general anxiety, maybe for reasons they can't articulate, this surrender feels dangerous. The brain interprets the approach of sleep as a threat rather than a refuge. There's also the matter of identity. During wakefulness, you have a consistent sense of self, a continuous I that persists through time. Sleep breaks that continuity. The person who falls asleep can't verify that they're the same person who wakes up. Memory provides the illusion of continuity, but memory can be unreliable. For someone already prone to existential anxiety, this nightly dissolution of self can feel threatening. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia often addresses this by helping people develop what's called sleep confidence, a learned trust in the process, a willingness to let go without fear. This involves gradually reducing the monitoring behavior, learning to tolerate the uncertainty of the transition, building evidence through repeated successful sleep experiences that letting go is safe. But for many people, the anxiety persists. They know intellectually that sleep is safe, that billions of people do it every night without consequence, yet the emotional response remains. As they approach the threshold, as consciousness begins to soften, anxiety flares, the body tenses, the mind sharpens, the transition reverses. What they're experiencing is, in a sense, the price of consciousness itself. The ability to be self-aware, to monitor your own mental states, to maintain vigilance. These capacities are valuable during waking hours, but they become obstacles at bedtime. The same mental skills that help you navigate a complex world during the day work against you at night. The insomnia isn't a failure, it's a success of the wrong system at the wrong time. The monitoring system refusing to shut down, even when shutting down is exactly what's needed. Understanding this doesn't always fix it, but sometimes recognizing that the anxiety is a misapplied protective mechanism rather than a personal failing can ease the secondary anxiety, the anxiety about the anxiety, and sometimes that's enough to tip the balance, to create just enough relaxation for the transition to finally occur. Some people try to solve the mystery by staying conscious through the transition. They attempt to maintain awareness as they fall asleep, to be present for the moment that's usually lost. These are lucid sleeping attempts, and they almost always fail, though the failure itself is instructive. Lucid dreaming is well established. People can learn to maintain a kind of consciousness during dreams, to recognize their dreaming and sometimes even control the dream content. But lucid sleeping, staying aware through the transition from wakefulness to sleep, is far more difficult. The obstacles are built into the process itself. The first problem is that maintaining awareness requires active mental engagement. You have to be monitoring your state, checking whether you're still awake, noticing the changes as they occur. But this monitoring activity is itself a form of wakefulness. It requires the brain to remain in an active processing mode, and that active mode is incompatible with sleep initiation. You can't observe the transition without preventing it. It's like trying to watch the exact moment you lose interest in something. The act of watching maintains the interest, or at least maintains attention, which prevents the natural drift away. To lose interest, you have to stop paying attention. To fall asleep, you have to stop monitoring whether you're falling asleep. Some meditation practitioners report being able to maintain a thin thread of awareness through the early stages of sleep. They describe a state where they're aware that consciousness is changing, where they can feel the transition happening, but they're not actively interfering with it. This requires a very specific kind of attention, awareness without effort, observation without engagement. Most people don't naturally have this skill, and developing it takes years of practice. Even for skilled meditators, there's a point where awareness can't continue. As the brain's arousal systems shut down, as the default mode network deactivates, as the hippocampus stops encoding memories, consciousness eventually has to extinguish. The neural machinery required for awareness is being dismantled. No amount of intention can keep it running once the underlying systems go offline. So lucid sleeping attempts typically end in one of two ways. Either the person successfully maintains enough awareness to prevent sleep entirely, they lie there observing their drowsiness but never actually transition, or they lose awareness at some point and have no memory of the transition, just like everyone else. The window where awareness and sleep onset can coexist is vanishingly small, perhaps only a few seconds, and even then, the awareness that persists is often too dim, too fragmented to form coherent memories. What these attempts reveal is that consciousness and sleep onset are fundamentally antagonistic. Consciousness is an active, energy-intensive process. Sleep onset requires that process to wind down. Trying to maintain one while initiating the other is like trying to accelerate and brake simultaneously. The systems work in opposition. One has to give way. This doesn't mean the attempts are useless. Even though they don't succeed in their stated goal, they can teach people about the gradual nature of the transition, about the early signs of sleep onset, about the feeling of consciousness softening. This knowledge can help reduce anxiety about sleep, can make the transition less mysterious even if it remains unobservable. Sometimes, accepting that you can't watch yourself fall asleep is what finally allows you to fall asleep in peace. Ask someone about the last thought they remember before falling asleep, and they'll often report something curious. That thought seems to immediately precede waking. Hours pass in between, but from the inside, those hours feel like no time at all. You remember lying in bed, thinking about tomorrow's meeting, or replaying a conversation from the day. That's the last thing in your memory. Then you're waking up, and the meeting or conversation feels like it was just a moment ago. The intervening sleep has no subjective duration. It's not experienced as a long stretch of time that passed. It's experienced as a gap, a cut, an absence. This creates the strange sensation that sleep compresses time. 8 hours in bed feels like it lasted seconds. The clock says otherwise. The dawn light confirms it. Your rested body proves it, but your subjective experience swears that no time passed. You went directly from lying down to waking up, even though objectively you didn't. This phenomenon exposes something fundamental about how time perception works. We don't experience time directly. We experience events, changes, thoughts, and then we infer the passage of time from the sequence of experiences. Without a sequence of experiences, without a mental narrative linking one moment to the next, time seems to collapse. During sleep, especially deep sleep, there are no experiences to create that narrative, or if there are, they're not being recorded in a way that's accessible to waking consciousness. The hippocampus isn't encoding, the prefrontal cortex isn't timestamping events, and the default mode network isn't creating an autobiographical storyline. So when you wake up, there's nothing to look back on, no mental breadcrumb trail indicating that time passed. The last thing you remember is your final waking thought, and now you're awake again, with nothing in between. Sometimes people wake briefly during the night without remembering it. They might shift position, open their eyes, even get up to use the bathroom. But if these events aren't encoded properly, they leave no trace. The morning memory includes only the last clear thought before sleep, and the first clear thought upon waking, with everything else compressed into apparent nothingness. This has implications for personal identity. If your sense of self is constructed from a continuous narrative of experience, then sleep creates a break in that narrative. The person who went to sleep and the person who woke up are connected by memory of the before and after, but not by any memory of the transition or the state in between. In a very real sense, you're unconscious of most of your life. Roughly a third of your existence is spent in a state you won't remember, a state that leaves no experiential trace beyond the biological fact that it occurred. Some philosophers have suggested that sleep is psychologically indistinguishable from death. Both involve the cessation of conscious experience and the inability to form memories. The only difference is that sleep is temporary. You return from it, and the return provides retrospective meaning to the absence. Death offers no such return, no perspective from which to look back and say, I was gone and now I'm back. But the actual experience, or rather the lack of experience, might be similar. This can be unsettling or comforting depending on your perspective. Unsettling because it suggests that each night you effectively cease to exist for hours at a time. Comforting because it demonstrates that non-existence isn't suffering. Those hours of sleep aren't experienced as an eternity of nothingness. They're simply not experienced at all. Watch a young child resist bedtime, and you'll see something primal. It's not just that they want to keep playing. Often, there's genuine fear involved. Fear of something they can't articulate but deeply feel. They're afraid of the disappearance. Children haven't yet learned to take consciousness for granted. They're still figuring out that the self persists across different states, that going to sleep doesn't mean ceasing to exist. For a toddler, the transition into sleep might genuinely feel like a kind of ending, a dissolution that's uncertain to reverse. The adult reassurance that you'll wake up in the morning doesn't yet have the weight of experience behind it. Morning is abstract. The disappearance happening right now is concrete. This is why bedtime routines matter so much for children. The routine creates predictability, a structure that implies continuity. The same story, the same stuffed animal, the same goodnight ritual. These establish a pattern suggesting that this has happened before and will happen again. That the transition is safe because it's familiar. The routine becomes evidence that you can let go of consciousness and return. As children age, they gradually internalize this evidence. They accumulate thousands of instances of falling asleep and waking up, and this repetition builds implicit trust. By adulthood, most people no longer consciously worry about whether they'll wake up. The fear has been trained away by experience. Sleep becomes so routine, so automatically trusted, that the existential strangeness of it disappears. But sometimes, even in adults, that childhood fear resurfaces. During periods of high stress or anxiety, during illness, after trauma, the old fear can come back. Suddenly, the transition that usually feels automatic feels uncertain. You lie there aware of the vulnerability, aware that you're about to lose control, and a voice from childhood whispers, "What if you don't come back?" Developmentally, learning to trust sleep is one of the first major exercises in trusting your own biology. The infant has no choice. Sleep simply overtakes them. The toddler begins to recognize that sleep is coming and resists it. The child slowly learns that resistance is futile and that surrender is safe. The adult forgets there was ever a lesson to learn. This progression mirrors a larger developmental journey, learning to trust processes you can't control. You can't control your heartbeat, your digestion, your immune response, your cellular repair. These systems operate below consciousness, and you have to trust they're working. Sleep is perhaps the most dramatic example, the daily reminder that you are not in complete command of your own mind, that there are processes larger than your conscious will that take over when conditions require it. Parents sometimes recognize this when comforting a frightened child at bedtime. The reassurances they offer, "I'll be here when you wake up," "You're safe," "It's just sleep," aren't just about that particular night. They're teaching the child something foundational, that it's safe to let go, that consciousness will return, that the self persists even through its own disappearance. This is a lesson every human has to learn, and some people take longer than others. Some never fully learn it. They carry that childhood fear forward, and it manifests as insomnia, as anxiety about sleep, as a subtle resistance to the nightly transition. Recognizing this can sometimes help. If your difficulty with sleep has roots in that early, inarticulate fear, then addressing the surface-level symptoms, counting sheep, controlling your sleep environment, might not be enough. The deeper work involves rebuilding that fundamental trust, accumulating new evidence that the transition is safe, gradually training your nervous system that letting go of consciousness is not a threat but a biological necessity. Humanity has never been comfortable leaving the sleep transition uninterpreted. Across cultures and centuries, people have looked at this daily disappearance and imposed meaning, weaving it into their understanding of life, death, consciousness, and the spirit. In many traditions, sleep has been viewed as a small death, a temporary departure of the soul from the body. Ancient Egyptians believed the soul traveled during sleep, journeying to other realms and returning by morning. This interpretation made the nightly vanishing less frightening. You weren't disappearing, you were traveling. Consciousness hadn't ended, it had relocated. Some indigenous cultures have held that sleep is when the spirit world becomes accessible, when the boundary between physical and spiritual reality becomes porous. Dreams in this view aren't just mental events, but encounters with actual beings or places. The transition into sleep isn't a neurological shutdown, but an opening, a crossing into territory that waking consciousness can't reach. Greek and Roman thinkers sometimes described sleep as a gift from the gods, particularly from Hypnos or Somnus, the deity of sleep. In this framing, the transition wasn't something your brain did, but something that happened to you, a state you were given permission to enter. Sleep wasn't absence, but presence, the presence of the divine, temporarily suspending your ordinary awareness. Medieval Christian thought sometimes treated the sleep transition with suspicion. If sleep was a kind of small death, then it was also a state of vulnerability to malevolent forces. Prayers before bed served as protection, rituals to ensure safe passage through the vulnerable unconscious hours. The transition required not just physical preparation, but spiritual fortification. Eastern philosophies have often taken a different approach. In Buddhist and Hindu traditions, sleep is sometimes described as one of several states of consciousness, no more or less real than waking. The transition between them is just another change in mental state, neither frightening nor particularly significant. What matters is maintaining awareness through all states, including, for advanced practitioners, sleep itself. The tradition of dream yoga aims to extend conscious awareness into sleep, treating the transition not as an ending but as an opportunity for practice. Modern secular culture has largely stripped away these metaphysical interpretations, replacing them with biological explanations. Sleep is what happens when your brain needs rest. The transition is a neurological process, nothing more. This demystification has been useful in some ways. It's reduced fear, improved treatment for sleep disorders, enabled better sleep hygiene, but it's also made the experience seem smaller, less meaningful, just a biological necessity, a maintenance cycle. Yet even in our neuroscience-informed age, the cultural interpretations haven't entirely disappeared. We still use metaphors borrowed from older traditions. We talk about drifting off as if consciousness is a boat floating away from shore. We say we lose consciousness as if it's something that can be found again. We describe deep sleep as being dead to the world, unconsciously invoking that ancient connection between sleep and death. These cultural narratives reveal something important. Humans need stories about the sleep transition. The biological facts alone don't satisfy the psychological need to make sense of this daily disappearance. We want to know not just what happens in the brain, but what it means, how to think about it, how to frame the experience in a way that makes it less strange or frightening or sad. The explanations vary by culture and era, but the need for explanation seems universal. We can't watch ourselves fall asleep, so we create stories about what the unwatchable transition might mean. If you can't remember the moment you fall asleep, something you do every day, something central to your experience, what else might you be missing? What other transitions, states, or moments does your brain hide from you? This isn't an idle question. The sleep onset amnesia reveals a fundamental truth about consciousness. Your awareness of your own mental states is incomplete. The brain doesn't give you full access to its operations. Some things are visible to introspection, but others remain forever hidden, and you often can't tell which is which. Consider the transition into any altered state. Anesthesia, for instance, shares many features with sleep. People report being aware one moment and awake again the next, with no memory of the transition or the unconscious period in between. But unlike sleep, where the gap can be explained away as natural forgetting, anesthesia makes the gap more obvious. You're in a medical setting, people are watching you lose consciousness, the event is documented, yet you still can't remember it happening or consider moments of intense emotion. Have you ever been asked, when did you start feeling angry, and struggled to answer? Emotions don't arrive with timestamps. They seem to be suddenly present, as if they were always there. The transition from calm to angry, from content to sad, from indifferent to interested, these shifts happen, but you rarely catch them happening. You notice the result, not the process. The same might be true for decisions. We like to think we make choices consciously, that we're aware of our own decision-making process. But research suggests that neural activity predicting a decision sometimes occurs before conscious awareness of making that decision. Your brain might be committed to a choice before the conscious aware self knows about it. The decision happens, and then awareness catches up, creating the retrospective illusion that you consciously chose. Memory itself is full of gaps. You don't remember most of your life, not in any detailed way. You remember highlights, significant events, moments tied to strong emotions, but the vast majority of your experiences, the ordinary hours, the routine days, vanish without a trace. You lived them, but they're gone now, unrecoverable. The continuity of self you feel is constructed from fragments, not from a complete record. Even perception has gaps. Your eyes move in rapid jumps called saccades several times per second, and during these movements your vision is essentially suppressed. You don't notice this because your brain fills in the gaps, creates the impression of continuous visual experience, but the continuity is artificial. There are blank moments you never see because the brain edits them out. The sleep onset amnesia is just one example of a broader phenomenon. Consciousness is edited, filtered, incomplete. Your brain presents you with a simplified, streamlined version of reality that feels complete but isn't. Gaps are covered over. Transitions are smoothed. The messiness of neural processing is hidden beneath a veneer of continuity and coherence. This raises an unsettling possibility. If you can't trust your memory of falling asleep, can you fully trust any memory? If you can't catch the transition into unconsciousness, how can you be certain you're catching other mental transitions? The architecture that hides sleep onset from you might be hiding other things too, presenting you with an edited version of your own experience that feels authentic but is actually incomplete. This doesn't mean nothing is knowable. It means self-knowledge has limits. There are aspects of your mind you cannot directly observe, no matter how hard you try. The blind spot at sleep onset is just the most obvious example of a more pervasive condition, being conscious but not fully conscious of consciousness itself. Each night you go to sleep, each morning you wake up. Between these two events, consciousness ceases. This raises a philosophical question that seems simple but opens into deep complexity. Is the person who wakes up the same person who went to sleep? Your intuition probably says yes. Of course you're the same person. You have the same body, the same memories, the same personality. The break in consciousness is temporary, not permanent. You're continuous across the gap. But look closer. What makes you you? If it's your body, then yes, there's continuity. The same physical organism that lay down is the one that wakes up. But the body changes constantly. Cells die and are replaced. Molecules cycle through. Over time, almost none of the specific atoms that composed your body years ago are still present. Physical continuity is less solid than it appears. If identity is based on memory, then sleep creates a different kind of problem. Memories connect your present self to your past self. You remember being the person who lived yesterday, so you conclude you're the same person. But what about the gap? You don't remember being the person who was deeply asleep. There's no memory connecting your unconscious self to your conscious self. The connection is inferred, not experienced. Some philosophers argue that personal identity requires psychological continuity, a continuous chain of mental states linking past to present. By this criterion, sleep creates a break in the chain. The unconscious sleeper isn't having psychological experiences, isn't forming memories, isn't maintaining the stream of consciousness that defines the waking self. The chain is broken every night and must be rebuilt every morning. This leads to a strange implication. If personal identity requires continuous consciousness, then you die every night and are reborn every morning. The person who wakes up is a new person, someone who inherits the memories and body of the previous person but isn't strictly identical to them. Each day you're a slightly different self, connected to yesterday's self by memory and physical continuity, but separated by the gap of unconsciousness. This isn't just abstract philosophy. It connects to real questions about responsibility and ethics. If you're not strictly the same person who existed yesterday, are you responsible for what that person did? Most people would say yes, but the justification becomes less clear once you accept that consciousness isn't continuous. We hold people accountable for past actions because we assume psychological continuity, but sleep, along with other states like anesthesia or coma, reveals that continuity is fragmented. Another approach is to argue that identity doesn't require consciousness at all. You're the same person while asleep because identity is based on something more fundamental, perhaps biological continuity, perhaps the ongoing functioning of the brain, perhaps the persistence of certain neural patterns even during unconsciousness. Consciousness, in this view, is just one state the self can be in. The self persists whether conscious or not, but this creates its own puzzles. If the self can exist without consciousness, what exactly is the self? Is it just the physical brain, the body, the pattern of information encoded in neural connections? And if it's the pattern, then is identity preserved if that pattern is transferred to a different substrate? These questions spiral outward, each answer generating new questions. The sleep transition forces these issues into everyday experience. Most philosophical puzzles about identity involve thought experiments, teleportation, brain transplants, gradual ship of Theseus replacements, but sleep is real, it's routine, and it genuinely creates a break in consciousness, a gap in experience, a cessation of the psychological continuity that seems central to being a person. Yet we navigate this break every night without existential crisis, treating the morning self as obviously continuous with the evening self. Maybe that's the answer. Personal identity is a useful fiction, a story we tell that's close enough to true for practical purposes. The continuity isn't perfect. The self isn't seamlessly persistent. Consciousness breaks and reforms, but memory provides enough connection. Physical continuity provides enough stability, and the pattern of personality persists reliably enough that treating the waking self as identical to the sleeping self works well enough to get by. Sleep has been compared to death for millennia, and the comparison isn't merely poetic. There are genuine similarities that make the parallel worth examining, even as we acknowledge the obvious crucial difference. You wake from sleep. Both sleep and death involve the cessation of consciousness. In both states, the subjective sense of existing, of being present, of experiencing time, all of this vanishes. Someone who is deeply asleep and someone who is dead are both, from their own perspective, experiencing nothing. The internal phenomenology, if we can even use that phrase, appears identical. Absence of experience, absence of time, absence of self, both involve loss of control and vulnerability. When you're asleep, you cannot respond to threats. You cannot make decisions. You are temporarily absent from the world in any meaningful interactive sense. Others could observe you, move you, potentially harm you, and you would have no awareness of it until you woke, if you woke. This is also true of death, except the potential for waking never arrives. Some ancient philosophers took this parallel seriously. Plato suggested that philosophers practiced dying through contemplation of death, familiarizing themselves with what it means to exist without the body's demands. Sleep, in this view, was a natural rehearsal, a nightly practice of letting go. The person who sleeps peacefully is someone who has made peace with mortality, who can release consciousness without fear, but the differences matter deeply. Sleep is temporary. Death, as far as we know, is not. This single distinction transforms the meaning of everything else. The cessation of consciousness during sleep is bearable precisely because it ends. You know, or at least believe, that morning will come. Without that expectation, the transition into unconsciousness might feel entirely different. There's also the matter of biological continuity. While you sleep, your body continues functioning. Your heart beats, you breathe, your brain remains active even as consciousness dims, cellular repair occurs. Memories consolidate, the immune system does maintenance work. Sleep is an active state of unconsciousness, if that phrase makes sense. Death involves the cessation of these processes. It's not just consciousness that ends, but the biological functions that would allow consciousness to return. Yet the comparison troubles us for a reason. Each night we do something that resembles dying. We let go of awareness. We surrender control. We enter a state we cannot observe from the inside. A state that could be indistinguishable from death if we didn't wake. The trust required to fall asleep, to voluntarily enter this death-like state, is extraordinary when you really consider it. Some people struggle with this trust. Thanatophobia, fear of death, can manifest as difficulty sleeping. The transition into unconsciousness triggers existential anxiety because it too closely resembles the ultimate transition. Lying in bed, feeling consciousness slip away, becomes psychologically unbearable when you're acutely aware that this nightly dress rehearsal eventually becomes the real thing. Others find comfort in the comparison. If death is like sleep, then perhaps it's not so terrible. Sleep isn't suffering. It's not experience at all, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. If death offers the same absence of experience, then it offers the same absence of suffering. The Epicurean argument that death is nothing to fear because you won't be there to experience it draws strength from the nightly demonstration that non-experience is not the same as suffering. The truth is probably that sleep and death share certain features while differing in the most important one. They both involve the cessation of consciousness, but one is a pause and the other is an ending. They both require surrender, but one includes the promise of return. They both happen to everyone, but only one is truly inevitable in the sense of being unrecoverable. Still, the nightly rehearsal might serve a purpose beyond rest. Perhaps facing the small death of sleep, accepting it night after night, makes the larger death less alien. Perhaps the familiarity we develop with letting go of consciousness, with trusting the transition, with experiencing the absence of experience, perhaps this prepares us in some small way for the transition that doesn't include mourning. Sleep might be nature's way of making death less strange, less sudden, less unprecedented. We practice dissolution thousands of times, so when the final dissolution comes, it's at least a familiar gesture, a transition we've made before, even if this time the return doesn't arrive. Every night you do something remarkable. You surrender control of your consciousness without any direct evidence that you'll get it back. You've never experienced the return from your own perspective. You're always unconscious when it happens, yet you trust it completely. This is a strange kind of trust. Usually trust is based on experience. You trust a bridge because you've walked across it before. You trust a person because they've been reliable in the past. You trust your memory because checking it against external records usually shows it's accurate. Experience builds evidence, and evidence builds trust, but you have no direct experience of the sleep-wake cycle from the inside. You experience going to sleep, and you experience being awake, but the connection between them is invisible to you. You infer that you were the one sleeping, that consciousness persisted in some latent form through the unconscious hours, that the person who wakes is continuous with the person who slept. But you never observe this continuity directly. From a purely experiential standpoint, the evidence is equally consistent with a different interpretation, that you cease to exist each night, and a new consciousness, equipped with your memories and in your body, emerges each morning. This new consciousness inherits everything from yesterday's consciousness, but isn't strictly identical to it. How would you know the difference? Both scenarios feel the same from the inside. You can't. This is the paradox. The trust you place in sleep, in the nightly transition, in the eventual return of consciousness, it's not based on direct evidence because direct evidence is impossible. You can never witness your own return to awareness. You're always already aware when awareness returns, which means the moment of return is just as invisible as the moment of departure. Yet this unfounded trust is so strong that most people never even think about it. You lie down expecting to wake up. You set an alarm with confidence it will rouse you. You make plans for tomorrow that assume you'll still exist to carry them out. The trust operates at a level below conscious thought, so deeply ingrained that questioning it seems absurd. This might be evolution's work. An organism that was afraid to sleep, that resisted the nightly transition out of fear it wouldn't return, would sleep poorly and suffer the consequences. Better to build in automatic trust. Trust that doesn't require evidence. Trust that operates whether justified or not. The organism that could surrender easily survived better than the one that fought the process. But there's something philosophically profound about this situation. It suggests that some of our deepest certainties, our belief in personal continuity, our expectation of future existence, our sense that the self persists through time, these aren't based on evidence in the normal sense. They're based on a kind of prior trust, a foundational confidence that consciousness will continue, that the self will remain, that tomorrow will arrive with you still in it. This trust can fail. People experiencing severe anxiety or depression sometimes lose it. The automatic expectation that consciousness will return gets disrupted. Sleep becomes frightening not because of what might happen during sleep, but because of the uncertainty about return. The trust that normally operates invisibly suddenly becomes visible by its absence, and the person becomes aware of just how little evidence supports the assumption that underlies everything. Restoring this trust isn't about gathering evidence. You can't prove to someone that they'll wake up tomorrow because they've always woken up before. That's circular reasoning, and more importantly, it misses the point. The trust operates below the level of rational justification. It's not a conclusion reached through evidence. It's a foundational stance that makes the gathering of evidence possible in the first place. Perhaps what this reveals is that consciousness requires certain leaps of faith built into its structure. To function, you have to trust that your experience is real, that your memory is generally reliable, that the self persists through time, that the future will arrive. These aren't conclusions you reach. They're assumptions you start with. Necessary preconditions for making sense of anything. The nightly surrender to sleep might be the most striking example of this necessary trust. You can't verify that consciousness will return, can't watch yourself wake up, can't accumulate direct evidence that the trust is warranted, yet you trust anyway, completely, every single night. And maybe that trust, that willing surrender despite the absence of proof, is as fundamental to being conscious as any neural mechanism or brain structure. We tend to think of consciousness as existing on a spectrum. You're fully awake, or drowsy, or deeply asleep, with gradual transitions between these states. But the abrupt disappearance at sleep onset suggests something different. That consciousness might actually function more like a binary state, flipping between on and off rather than dimming gradually. This contradicts our intuitions. Subjectively, it feels like awareness fades smoothly. You get drowsier, thoughts become sluggish, attention wavers. But what if this sense of gradual fading is itself an illusion created by consciousness operating at partial capacity? What if the underlying reality is that consciousness is either present or absent, with no genuine middle ground? Consider the evidence. When researchers wake people at different points during sleep onset and ask about their conscious state, the reports don't show a smooth gradient. They show something choppier. People report being aware, then not aware, then briefly aware again, then not. The pattern looks more like a light flickering on and off than a dimmer gradually lowering. Brain imaging supports this interpretation. The neural networks that underlie consciousness don't fade smoothly in unified fashion. Instead, different systems shut down at different rates, creating a period where some aspects of consciousness are present while others are absent. You might lose the ability to form memories while retaining sensory awareness, or lose the sense of self while still processing thoughts. The dissolution isn't smooth, it's fragmented, piecemeal. This suggests that what we call consciousness might not be a single thing, but a collection of processes that usually operate together. When these processes are all active, We experience full waking consciousness. When they're all inactive, we're deeply unconscious. But during transitions, some are on while others are off, creating hybrid states that feel like partial consciousness but might actually be consciousness flickering between presence and absence. The microsleeps mentioned earlier support this view. During a microsleep, consciousness doesn't dim to half strength. It vanishes completely, then returns. The person doesn't experience a gradient of awareness declining and then increasing. They experience a gap, a moment where they weren't present at all. This suggests an on-off dynamic rather than a volume control. If consciousness is binary, this has implications for understanding its neural basis. It means there's probably some critical threshold in the brain, some tipping point where the systems maintaining consciousness either sustain themselves or collapse. Above the threshold, consciousness is present. Below it, consciousness is absent. And during sleep onset, the brain is hovering around this threshold, sometimes crossing it briefly before returning, sometimes sticking on one side or the other. This threshold model could explain why catching the moment of sleep onset is impossible. You're trying to observe a discrete transition, a flip from on to off, but observation requires consciousness to be on. So by the time you've crossed the threshold, there's no consciousness present to register that the crossing happened. It's not that the transition is too gradual to catch. It's that the transition is instantaneous, and only one side of it is observable. This isn't to say that brain activity is binary. Neural processes operate on continuous scales, firing rates, neurotransmitter levels, electrical oscillations. All of these change gradually during sleep onset. But consciousness as a high-level phenomenon emerging from these processes might still have a threshold character. Below certain levels of arousal, certain patterns of connectivity, consciousness simply isn't present, regardless of how close you are to the threshold. This binary view also fits with the subjective experience of waking up. You don't gradually regain consciousness in a smooth, continuous way. One moment you're not aware, and the next moment you are. It can feel instantaneous, like flipping a switch. Yes, there are times when you wake slowly, drowsily, but even then, the transition from not conscious to conscious seems to have a discrete character. If this is correct, if consciousness really does operate more like a switch than a dimmer, then the impossibility of catching sleep onset is even more fundamental than previously suggested. It's not just that memory fails or that the neural systems required for observation shut down, it's that there's literally no middle ground to observe. Consciousness is either present to witness itself or absent entirely. The transition happens in an instant too brief and too total for awareness to span. Some things about your own experience might be fundamentally inaccessible to you, not because the tools for observation aren't good enough, not because you haven't tried hard enough, but because observation itself changes or prevents what you're trying to observe. The moment of falling asleep is one example. The nature of the phenomenon ensures it can't be witnessed. To witness it would require remaining conscious, but remaining conscious prevents the phenomenon from occurring. This isn't a limitation of technology or technique. It's built into the structure of the thing itself. Physics has concepts like this. Situations where observation affects the observed system so fundamentally that you can't separate the thing from the measuring of it. The uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics isn't about imprecise instruments. It's about a deeper limit. Certain pairs of properties can't both have definite values simultaneously. Knowing one precisely makes the other inherently uncertain. Sleep onset has a similar character. Consciousness can't observe its own ending because the observer is what's ending. The tools of observation are the thing being dismantled. This makes the transition unknowable, not accidentally but essentially. No future neuroscience breakthrough will let you capture the moment you fall asleep, because consciousness itself is what would need to do the capturing, and consciousness is precisely what's disappearing. This might seem frustrating. We live in an age that celebrates knowledge, measurement, understanding. The idea that something is fundamentally unknowable feels like failure, like there must be a way around it if we just think harder or develop better tools. But perhaps there's value in recognizing limits. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved because not all mysteries are problems. Some are just features of reality, boundaries that define what's possible rather than what's discovered so far. Accepting this doesn't mean giving up curiosity. You can still explore around the edges of the unknowable, still understand the neural mechanics of sleep onset, still map out brain states and chemical changes, but you can let go of the expectation that eventually, with enough knowledge, you'll be able to watch yourself fall asleep. That particular direct observation is not in the future. It's not in anyone's future. The architecture of consciousness doesn't permit it. There's something almost peaceful about this acceptance. It means you can stop trying to catch the uncatchable. You can release the vigilance, the monitoring, the attempt to stay aware through the transition. If it's fundamentally impossible, then your failure to achieve it isn't personal failing. It's universal human experience. Everyone loses this moment. You're not missing something others have found. This extends beyond sleep. There are probably other aspects of your own mental life that remain unavailable to introspection. The actual computational processes your brain uses to generate thoughts, make decisions, produce emotions, most of this happens below the level of awareness. You experience the outputs but not the processing. And maybe that's okay. Maybe consciousness doesn't need to be transparent to itself to function. Maybe the opacity is part of how it works. The unknowable moments might even serve important purposes. If you could watch yourself fall asleep, would you sleep as well? If you had access to every unconscious process, would decision-making become paralyzed by over-analysis? Sometimes not knowing is what enables doing. So perhaps the mystery of sleep onset isn't a problem awaiting solution, but a reminder that consciousness has its limits, its boundaries, its blind spots, and that these limitations aren't failures but features. You're designed to miss this moment. The gap is intentional, the forgetting is built in, and maybe instead of fighting against this design, resisting it, trying to overcome it, there's something to be said for simply acknowledging it, for recognizing that you'll never catch this moment, and that's exactly how it should be. Consciousness exists only in the present. You're always experiencing. Now, never yesterday, never tomorrow, only this moment. But what exactly is now? How long does it last? And what does this tell us about why consciousness can't witness its own ending? Neuroscientists have tried to measure the duration of the present moment. Studies suggest that the brain integrates information over a span of roughly 2 to 3 seconds, creating what we experience as now. Events within this window feel simultaneous, part of a single present moment. Events outside it feel past or future. This integration window explains various perceptual phenomena. When you hear a sentence, you don't experience each word as a separate, isolated event. The words flow together into a unified present moment, a coherent now that spans multiple seconds. Your brain holds recent events in a kind of short-term buffer, blending them into continuous experience, but this presents a problem for observing sleep onset. If consciousness is always experiencing now, if the present moment is always rolling forward, carrying you along, then how could consciousness observe its own stopping? To witness the end of consciousness, you'd need a perspective outside the present moment, a vantage point from which you could see now coming to a halt. But consciousness never has that vantage point. It's always inside the present moment, constituted by the present moment, incapable of stepping outside to observe it from without. It's a bit like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. Your eyes are the instruments of vision. They can see everything except themselves. Consciousness is similar. It's the instrument of awareness, the thing that does the experiencing. It can be aware of almost everything except its own fundamental operations, including its own ending. The present moment also has another feature. It's constructed retroactively. Research on timing suggests that your brain doesn't experience events in real time. There's a small delay while neural processing occurs, and then consciousness catches up, presenting you with what feels like the immediate present, but is actually a reconstruction of the very recent past. Your sense of now is always slightly behind actual neural events. This means that by the time you're conscious of any mental state, that state has already passed. The present moment of consciousness is, paradoxically, always about the immediate past. You're perpetually slightly behind yourself, experiencing a reconstructed version of what your brain was doing a fraction of a second ago. If this is how consciousness works, always operating on a slight delay, always reconstructing recent past as present, then witnessing sleep onset becomes doubly impossible. By the time consciousness would register that sleep is beginning, the neural systems generating consciousness have already shut down. The delay ensures that consciousness is always too late to catch its own ending. Imagine a security guard whose job is to watch a building and lock the door when leaving. But the guard is the last one in the building, and locking the door requires going outside. The guard can witness everyone else leaving but cannot witness their own departure while also fulfilling the duty of locking up. To leave, they must stop watching. To watch, they must not leave. Consciousness faces the same impossibility. The perpetual present moment also means consciousness has no memory of times when it wasn't present. During deep sleep, during anesthesia, during any period of unconsciousness, these times leave no trace in experience because there was no experience to leave a trace. The present moment can't contain its own absence. When consciousness is gone, there's no now in which to register that it's gone. This is why the subjective experience of sleep feels like zero duration. You go to sleep and then you wake up, and no time seems to have passed because there was no present moment during the intervening hours. The stream of now simply stopped and then resumed. From the inside, it feels instantaneous regardless of how many hours elapsed. So consciousness, perpetually trapped in its rolling present moment, perpetually reconstructing the recent past as present experience, can never observe the moment it ceases. The architecture of the present moment, its construction, its continuity, its inability to contain its own absence, ensures that sleep onset remains forever beyond the reach of direct experience. Meditation practices often involve maintaining awareness through changing mental states. Practitioners learn to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations without attachment, developing a kind of witnessing consciousness that remains stable even as mental content shifts. Some wonder whether this skill could extend to sleep onset, whether a trained meditator could maintain awareness through the transition. Advanced meditators report various experiences at the edge of sleep. Some describe being aware that the body has fallen asleep while the mind remains alert, a state called yogic sleep or yoga nidra in some traditions. Others report noticing the early stages of the transition, the shift in thought patterns, the appearance of hypnagogic imagery, the gradual dissolution of the sense of self. But even the most advanced practitioners report losing the thread at some point. There's a stage beyond which awareness can't continue, where the biological processes of sleep onset override any attempt to maintain consciousness. The systems that generate awareness are the same systems that need to shut down for sleep to occur. Eventually, those systems win. What meditation practice does provide is familiarity with the early stages. A meditator who has spent thousands of hours observing their own mind becomes sensitive to subtle shifts in consciousness. They notice when attention becomes less stable, when the default mode network starts to quiet, when thoughts lose their usual logical coherence. They can feel the approach of sleep in a way most people don't. This heightened sensitivity doesn't mean they can prevent or capture the final transition, but it does mean they're less likely to fear it. Meditation builds comfort with letting go, with allowing mental states to change without resistance. The meditator approaches sleep not as an enemy to be fought or a mystery to be solved, but as another state to flow into, another transformation to allow. There's a parallel here with the concept of non-grasping in Buddhist practice. Trying to hold on to consciousness as you fall asleep is itself a form of grasping, an attempt to control what needs to happen naturally. The effort creates tension, and tension interferes with sleep. Meditation teaches the opposite, observing without interfering, being aware without holding on, allowing states to arise and pass without resistance. From this perspective, the inability to capture sleep onset isn't a limitation but a lesson. It teaches that not everything can be controlled or observed, that sometimes awareness needs to release its grip, that consciousness is a process that includes its own ending. The meditator learns this lesson repeatedly, in the ending of each breath, in the passing of each thought, in the arising and dissolving of countless mental states. Sleep onset is just the most dramatic example. Some traditions suggest that dying might be similar to falling asleep, and that meditation practice prepares the mind for that final transition. If you can become comfortable with the nightly dissolution of consciousness, if you can learn to let go without fear, then perhaps the ultimate letting go becomes less frightening. This doesn't mean meditation defeats death, but it might change the relationship to it. Whether or not this is true, meditation does seem to help with sleep itself. Studies show that people who meditate regularly tend to fall asleep faster and sleep more deeply. This might be because meditation reduces the anxiety and mental hyperactivity that interfere with sleep onset. Or it might be because meditation teaches the fundamental skill that sleep requires, the ability to stop trying, to let go of control, to allow consciousness to do what it naturally does when given permission. The meditator still can't catch the moment of falling asleep. That remains impossible, but they might approach it differently, not as a problem to solve or a state to resist, but as a daily invitation to practice surrender, to rehearse letting go, to experience the dissolving of self-awareness, and then, come morning, its mysterious return. You've fallen asleep thousands of times. If you're 30 years old, that's roughly 11,000 sleep cycles. By 50, it's 18,000. Each time, consciousness disappeared and then returned, the transition forever invisible, the mechanism forever mysterious, and yet you keep doing it. There's something stabilizing about this repetition. Each successful cycle builds implicit evidence that the process works. You don't remember crossing the threshold, but you remember waking up, and waking up proves the crossing happened safely. The evidence accumulates not through witnessing, but through outcome. Morning after morning after morning, consciousness returns, reliable as clockwork despite the nightly vanishing. This repetition creates a kind of bodily wisdom, a knowing that exists below conscious thought. Your nervous system has experienced this cycle so many times that it no longer questions it. The transition has become routine, automatic, trusted. Your body knows how to fall asleep, even though you, the conscious, aware self, can't observe or control the process. Think about how different your relationship to sleep is now compared to when you were very young. Infants fight sleep, resist it, cry against it. Toddlers negotiate for more time awake. Young children sometimes fear bedtime, but most adults simply accept it. The resistance has been trained away by thousands of successful cycles. Your system has learned that letting go is safe because letting go has always been safe. This isn't quite the same as conscious memory. You don't remember most of those 11,000 or 18,000 transitions. They've left no individual trace. They've left a collective imprint, a pattern learned through repetition rather than through any single memorable instance. Your body carries the history of all those successful vanishings and returns, and this history manifests as trust. When this trust breaks down, through trauma, through severe insomnia, through disruption of the sleep-wake cycle, the depth of its absence becomes obvious. Suddenly sleep is no longer automatic. The transition that once happened effortlessly now feels uncertain, dangerous. Without the accumulated weight of 10,000 safe crossings, each single crossing becomes fraught with anxiety. The repetition had been doing quiet work, building confidence that was invisible until it disappeared. For most people, though, the repetition continues unbroken or nearly so. Night after night, the same mysterious process. Night after night, the same gap in memory. Night after night, the same morning confirmation that whatever happened during the invisible hours, it preserved you intact. The mystery doesn't diminish through repetition. You never actually see what you're doing, but the comfort increases. There's a kind of faith built through this repetition. Not faith in any religious sense, but faith that some processes can be trusted despite not being understood. You don't need to know how you fall asleep to rely on your ability to do it. You don't need to witness the transition to believe it will complete successfully. The 10,000 previous completions are evidence enough. This faith might extend to other aspects of existence. Much of your life is governed by processes you don't understand and can't observe. Your body manages countless systems, immune response, cellular repair, hormone regulation, without any input from consciousness. You breathe without monitoring it. Your heart beats without permission. And through repetition, through living with these processes for years, you learn to trust them even though they remain opaque. Sleep onset is perhaps the most dramatic example because it involves consciousness itself, the thing that does all the observing and understanding. If you can learn to trust a process that involves the temporary extinction of the observer, then you can learn to trust almost anything. The nightly repetition isn't just about sleep. It's a training in letting go, in accepting that not everything needs to be watched, controlled, or understood. Some things work better when you simply allow them to happen. 10,000 times you've crossed this threshold. 10,000 times consciousness has vanished and returned. The repetition hasn't revealed the mechanism, but it's revealed something else, that the mechanism doesn't need revealing. The process is reliable without being observable, safe without being understood, worthy of trust despite the mystery. The missing moment at sleep onset reveals something fundamental. Consciousness is not sovereign over itself. It cannot observe all of its own operations. It cannot control its own existence. It is subject to processes deeper and older than self-awareness. This contradicts a common intuition. We tend to feel like consciousness is the core of who we are, the essential self, the thing in charge. We identify with awareness, with the observing mind, with the part that knows it's conscious. And from that perspective, it feels like consciousness should have full access to its own workings. But sleep onset demonstrates otherwise. Consciousness cannot watch itself begin or end. It cannot observe the neural machinery that generates it. It cannot prevent or delay its own dissolution when sleep arrives. The very systems that create the sense of being in control are themselves controlled by deeper mechanisms, circadian rhythms, homeostatic sleep pressure, brainstem structures that predate conscious thought by hundreds of millions of years. This suggests a hierarchy. Consciousness is not at the top, directing everything. It's a layer, a process, something that emerges from underlying biology and remains dependent on that biology. When the underlying systems need sleep, consciousness doesn't get a vote. It simply ends, and the ending is designed to be invisible to the thing ending. This has implications for free will, for agency, for the sense of being an autonomous, self-making, independent choices. If consciousness can't even control its own existence, if it's extinguished nightly by processes it neither chooses nor observes, then how much control does it really have over anything? The boundaries of consciousness are set by biology, by chemistry, by neural architecture. Within those boundaries there might be some room for choice, for agency, but the boundaries themselves are non-negotiable. Sleep onset also reveals that consciousness is discontinuous. It stops and starts, it fragments. The seamless continuity you feel is constructed, not inherent. Actual neural processes involve gaps, pauses, shifts between states. Consciousness papering over these gaps creates the illusion of unbroken presence, but the papering over is itself revealed when the gaps become too large to hide, as they do during sleep. This discontinuity raises questions about unity. We speak of consciousness as if it's a single thing, but maybe it's better understood as a coalition of processes that usually coordinate but don't always. During sleep onset, these processes decouple. Memory encoding shuts down while sensory processing continues. The sense of self dissolves while thoughts persist briefly. The coalition comes apart, revealing that consciousness was never quite the unified phenomenon it seemed. What this teaches, ultimately, is humility. Consciousness, this thing that feels so central, so essential, so sovereign, is actually contingent, limited, fragmentary. It exists only under certain conditions. It relies on neural infrastructure it doesn't control. It can be turned off without permission and without witness. It arises from processes it will never fully understand, and it depends on systems that operate whether consciousness knows about them or not. This humility might be uncomfortable for those who place consciousness at the center of meaning or value. If consciousness is so fragile, so contingent, so easily extinguished, what does that mean for its importance? But maybe the lesson is different. Maybe consciousness is precious precisely because it's temporary, meaningful precisely because it's not guaranteed. The nightly dissolution doesn't diminish its value. It emphasizes how remarkable it is that consciousness exists at all, that every morning it reforms, that the gap is bridged and presence returns. The missing moment at sleep onset, then, is a window into the architecture of mind itself. It shows where awareness can and cannot reach, what it can and cannot know about its own operations. It reveals consciousness as process rather than thing, as emergent rather than fundamental, as limited rather than unlimited. And in revealing these limits, it might also reveal something about how to hold consciousness more lightly, not as the totality of existence, but as one aspect of being, remarkable and wonderful but not sovereign, present and valuable precisely because it's temporary. Perhaps the inability to remember sleep onset isn't a flaw in the design. Perhaps it's the design working exactly as it should, providing something essential that conscious observation would disrupt. Sleep requires surrender. You have to stop trying, stop monitoring, stop holding yourself in wakefulness. You have to let go of control completely, and for many people, letting go is difficult. The mind wants to stay vigilant, to remain in charge, to observe what's happening. This vigilance prevents sleep. If you could remember the transition, if you could form a clear memory of consciousness dissolving, what would that memory contain? The sensation of losing yourself, of coming apart, of the self fragmenting and vanishing. Even if the process is painless, even if it's peaceful, the content of such a memory might be disturbing. You would know vividly what it feels like to cease being aware. You would carry that knowledge with you every time you lay down to sleep. For some people, this knowledge might create anxiety. Instead of relaxing into sleep, they might tense against it, resisting the transition they can now remember all too well. The vividness of the memory could transform a natural biological process into a nightly ordeal, each sleep onset colored by anticipation of the dissolution to come. The forgetting prevents this. By hiding the transition from memory, the brain removes a potential source of resistance. You approach sleep without detailed knowledge of what's about to happen. You know you're going to fall asleep, but you don't know how it will feel because you've never successfully captured that feeling. The absence of memory creates a kind of innocence, a freshness, that makes each transition easier. This might be especially important given how many times you need to sleep. If you're going to do something thousands of times, it helps if the process doesn't accumulate psychological weight. Each sleep onset is, in a sense, the first sleep onset because you have no specific memory of the others. The slate is clean every night. There's also the matter of vulnerability. Sleep is a vulnerable state. You're unconscious, unresponsive, potentially in danger. Evolution built in various protections. Certain sounds can wake you. Uncomfortable positions shift you. The nervous system maintains some monitoring of the environment even during sleep. But consciousness itself is a liability during this vulnerable state. Too much awareness would interfere with the deep rest needed. The memory gap might serve as a final protection, ensuring that consciousness doesn't linger at the threshold, half watching itself dissolve. Better to engineer the system so that consciousness can't observe its own ending, so that the last moment of awareness is followed immediately, from the experiencer's perspective, by the first moment of waking. The gap protects both the falling asleep and the being asleep, allowing both to occur without interference from the observing mind. So maybe this forgetting is a gift, not something taken from you, but something you're spared. The absence of memory enables the presence of rest. The blind spot at sleep onset allows you to cross that threshold thousands of times without accumulation of psychological resistance, without vivid memories of dissolution creating fear, without the process becoming burdened by its own observation. You might not be able to catch the moment you fall asleep, but perhaps not catching it is what allows you to fall asleep at all. The gap serves a purpose. The forgetting enables the function. And if consciousness must have blind spots, if there must be moments it cannot observe, then sleep onset might be exactly the right moment to hide. No matter how much neuroscience advances, No matter how thoroughly researchers map the brain states and chemical changes and neural oscillations of sleep onset, one thing will remain. You still won't be able to catch yourself doing it. Science can describe what happens from the outside. Instruments can track brain waves, monitor blood flow, measure neurotransmitter levels. Researchers can wake you at carefully timed intervals and ask what you are experiencing. They can piece together a detailed picture of the transition from many different angles, creating a comprehensive external account of sleep onset. But none of this gives you access to the internal experience of crossing the threshold. The instruments see what you can never see. The researchers observe what remains invisible to the subject. The gap between third-person description and first-person experience never closes, not because the science is incomplete, but because the gap is inherent. This makes sleep onset perpetually new. Every night you approach a mystery you've encountered thousands of times but never actually witnessed. Every night you cross a threshold that remains forever unknown from the inside. The routine familiarity of sleep doesn't diminish this strangeness. If anything, the familiarity makes it stranger. How can something you do every single day, something you've done for your entire life, remain so completely mysterious? There's something almost poetic about this. In a world where so much is explained, quantified, reduced to mechanism, sleep onset preserves a pocket of irreducible mystery right at the center of daily experience. Not mystery in the sense of something that might eventually be solved, but mystery in the sense of something that's fundamentally closed to direct observation. A lived experience that's simultaneously universal and unshareably private. You'll never know what sleep onset feels like from your own perspective, because the perspective required to feel it is the perspective that vanishes in the process. You can know what drowsiness feels like. You can know what hypnagogic imagery feels like. You can know what waking up feels like. But the actual moment of transition, the point where wakefulness becomes sleep, that remains inaccessible, not accidentally but essentially, and perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps consciousness should have at least one moment it cannot capture, one transition it cannot observe, one experience that remains forever outside its reach. Perhaps the sovereignty of awareness needs limits, edges it cannot cross, mysteries it cannot penetrate. Sleep onset provides this limit, this edge, this mystery, and does so with such regularity that the mystery becomes familiar without ever becoming known. So tonight, when you lie down, you'll be approaching something you've done countless times before but have never directly experienced. The approach is familiar, the result is predictable, but the moment itself, that sliver of time when consciousness ends and sleep begins, will remain as mysterious tonight as it was on your very first night. The same unknowable threshold crossed for the 10,000th time, as strange and unreachable now as ever. This isn't a problem to fix. It's simply what sleep onset is, an everyday mystery, a routine impossibility, a nightly encounter with the limits of self-knowledge. The explanation doesn't change the experience because the experience is precisely the absence of experience, the gap that cannot be filled, the moment that cannot be captured. Every night, the same mystery. Every night, the same vanishing. Every night, the threshold waits, forever familiar and forever unknown. There might be wisdom in the brain's design here, in the way consciousness is built to release itself without observation. The inability to witness your own fading might not be a limitation, but an expression of something deeper about how awareness works, about what it means to be conscious at all. Consciousness, in some sense, is about holding on. It's about maintaining coherence, continuity, the sense of being a unified self persisting through time. It's about gathering information, processing it, forming it into experience. The whole apparatus of awareness is dedicated to grasping, to holding, to maintaining presence in the world. But sleep requires the opposite. It requires letting go, releasing the hold, allowing the coherence to dissolve, and perhaps consciousness, by its nature, cannot deliberately let go of itself. To deliberately release awareness would require awareness to persist through its own release, which is contradictory. The only way for consciousness to let go is for the letting go to happen without conscious participation. This is where the blind spot becomes necessary. If you could watch yourself fall asleep, you'd be attempting to hold on while letting go simultaneously. The observation would prevent the release. The monitoring would maintain the very coherence that needs to dissolve. By making the transition invisible, the brain removes this conflict. Consciousness doesn't have to let go deliberately. It's simply released by processes operating at a deeper level. There's a parallel here with certain spiritual teachings about surrender and control. Many traditions emphasize that true letting go cannot be forced, that surrender cannot be willful. To try to surrender is to maintain the I who is trying, which is the opposite of surrender. Real letting go happens when the trying stops, when the observer dissolves, when control ceases without any controlling agent orchestrating the cessation. Sleep onset is this teaching embodied in biology. Every night you practice surrender without willfulness, letting go without trying to let go. The transition happens not because you make it happen, but because the system's underlying consciousness have their own wisdom, their own timing, their own mechanisms for initiating release when release is needed. This might explain why trying to control sleep usually backfires. The effort to fall asleep maintains exactly the kind of vigilance that prevents sleep. You're trying to observe and control a process that requires the observer and controller to step aside. The paradox resolves only when you stop trying, when you give up the attempt to manage the transition, when you allow the deeper processes to do what they do without interference. Understanding this won't necessarily make falling asleep easier. Knowing that you can't control it doesn't automatically confer the ability to not control it, but it might shift the relationship to sleep, might reduce the frustration of trying to catch what cannot be caught, might transform the nightly transition from something you're failing to observe into something you're allowing to happen. The blind spot at sleep onset, seen this way, is not about consciousness being limited, but about consciousness being appropriately designed. Awareness has its domain, waking life, decisions, observations, experiences, and it has its boundary, the moment where awareness itself needs to end so rest can occur. The boundary is necessary. The blind spot serves a purpose. Consciousness letting go without watching itself let go is exactly how the system should work. Perhaps other aspects of life follow this pattern. Perhaps genuine transformation, real change, deep healing all require a similar kind of letting go without observation. Perhaps the things that matter most happen not when we're watching carefully, but when we stop watching, when we trust the deeper processes, when we allow consciousness to release its grip and let something larger than awareness take over. Soon you'll do it again. You'll lie down, you'll settle, you'll let your thoughts drift, and at some point, a point you'll never identify, consciousness will end. The transition that's happened thousands of times before will happen once more, as mysterious tonight as it was the very first time. You can't prepare for it. You can't brace yourself, or pay extra attention, or try harder to notice. The more you try, the less likely it is to happen. The transition requires your absence, not your vigilance. It happens best when you've stopped trying to make it happen, stopped watching for it to arrive, and that might be the most important thing to understand. The mystery isn't something to solve, but something to allow. The gap isn't something to fill, but something to accept. The forgetting isn't failure, but design. You're supposed to miss this moment. The architecture of sleep ensures it. So tonight, when you find yourself approaching that threshold, you can let go of the expectation that you'll catch it. You won't, you never have, and you never will. But that's not a problem. It's permission. Permission to stop monitoring, to stop checking whether you're asleep yet, to stop trying to hold on to awareness as it fades. The transition will happen when it happens. The systems that manage it, circadian rhythms, sleep pressure, neural mechanisms refined over millions of years of evolution, don't need your help. They know what they're doing. They've been putting humans to sleep successfully since long before consciousness evolved enough to wonder about the process. Your only job is to not interfere, to lie there, to let your thoughts wander, to allow drowsiness when it comes, To stop checking, stop questioning, stop trying to catch the uncatchable. The mystery will take care of itself because the mystery is how the process works. And tomorrow morning, you'll wake up. You'll have successfully crossed the threshold again without witnessing it. 8 hours will have passed in what feels like an instant, and this gap, this absence, this missing time, it won't be loss. It'll be rest. It'll be recovery. It'll be the nightly maintenance your brain and body require to function. The amnesia that seems like a problem is actually the solution. You can't remember falling asleep because remembering would prevent sleeping. The forgetting is what allows the rest. The blind spot is what makes the transition possible. So embrace the mystery. Accept the gap. Trust the process that's worked thousands of times before. You don't need to understand it or observe it or capture it. You just need to let it happen. And it will happen, as it always does, in the moment you'll never see, in the transition you'll never catch, in the vanishing that preserves itself by remaining forever invisible. Tonight, once again, consciousness will end and you won't notice it ending. Sleep will arrive and you won't see it arrive. Hours will pass and you won't experience them passing. And then morning will come and you'll open your eyes and the whole mysterious process will have completed successfully one more time despite, or perhaps because of, your complete inability to witness it. This is how it works. This is how it always worked. The moment you can't catch, the transition you can't observe, the mystery you can't solve, it's not a bug in consciousness, it's a feature, and it's waiting for you tonight, as it waits every night, ready to receive you the moment you stop trying to watch it happen. Let it come. You won't see it arrive. But that's exactly how it should be.